It was Christmas Eve when I learned that family love can have an expiration date. My name is Riley Rogers, and I stood in the snow outside my parents' glowing house, holding gifts they'd never open, while my brother blocked the doorway and called me a failure. That single moment unraveled years of quiet sacrifice, every dollar I'd spent, every piece of myself I'd given to keep their world intact. What happens when the responsible one finally refuses to play savior? Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The road back to Cedar Falls looked the same as it always had: rows of snow-capped mailboxes, bare trees bending under the weight of the storm, and houses glowing faintly behind their curtains, like scenes from someone else's warm life. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, the bag of wrapped gifts in the passenger seat brushing against my coat every time I turned. The radio hummed with Christmas songs that used to make me smile, but tonight, they just filled the silence I couldn't stand. I told myself I was ready. I told myself that this year would be different. I was lying. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, the snow had thickened into something closer to fog. The porch light was on, steady and cold, the same bulb my father had never bothered to replace for years. Through the frosted window, I saw silhouettes moving, my mother glass of wine in hand, my father hunched in his armchair, and Connor, my brother, standing near the fire, like the hero of some Hallmark movie. The smell of pine hit me when I opened the car door, the wind carrying traces of cinnamon and wood smoke. I took a deep breath and stepped into it. Inside the front door, I could already hear laughter, the high-pitched squeals of my nephews, the soft hum of Christmas music, the familiar pop of my mother's favorite Chardonnay. For a second, I let myself imagine that this was still home. I'd spent weeks picking out those gifts, art kits for the kids, a new coat for my mother, a monogrammed decanter for my father. I even wrapped them in the old plaid paper my grandmother used when we were children. I wanted it to feel right, like we were still a family. But the second the door cracked open, I knew I'd made a mistake. Connor stood in the doorway, blocking my view inside. He was wearing a pressed sweater and the smug kind of grin that said he'd been waiting for this. Behind him, I caught a glimpse of the tree, glowing gold presents piled high, stockings embroidered with everyone's names except mine. "Hey," I said softly, lifting the bag. "I brought the gifts for the boys." He didn't move. He leaned one shoulder against the frame and said almost casually, "Mom said we're keeping it small this year." I blinked. "I know. That's why I only got the kids something. I just wanted to—" He cut me off with a shrug. "Yeah, it's just, we agreed it's no place for failures." The words hit harder than the cold. For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. "What did you just say?" He smiled wider, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Come on, Riley. Don't make it weird. You've been doing your thing, right, freelance or whatever? It's just, we're trying to keep the mood up this year." Behind him, I saw my mother glance over her glass, pretending not to hear. My father didn't look up. The lights from the tree blurred as my eyes stung. Connor stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Don't take it personally. We just don't need any more drama." Drama. That was what they called it when I left my corporate job to start my design studio, when I stopped lending Connor money, when I refused to co-sign his second mortgage. To them, independence was rebellion. Boundaries were betrayal. "I see," I said quietly. My voice sounded unfamiliar. "Well, Merry Christmas, Connor." He nodded, already half turned back toward the living room. "Yeah, you too, sis." I stood there for a moment, the cold seeping through my boots. My fingers tightened around the bag until the paper crinkled. The laughter inside the house grew louder, muffled through the closed door, like I was listening from another world. My mother's voice floated through the noise, warm and practiced. "Connor. Honey, did you light the fire yet?" He called back. "Yeah, Mom. All good." I wanted to scream, to ask why it was so easy for them to erase me, but instead I took one step back, then another. The porch light caught the falling snow, scattering it like glitter over the steps. I looked down at the gifts, the ribbons slightly frayed from the wind. I had picked every one of them with care late nights after work, sale alerts tracking numbers. Love disguised as logistics. I set the bag gently by the door, not because I wanted to leave something behind, but because I needed to let go. When I turned toward my car, the cold air filled my lungs like truth. The street was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your skin. For the first time, I noticed how empty the neighborhood looked, every house glowing from the inside, every window framing a version of warmth I didn't belong to. Driving home, the lights blurred past like ghosts. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just kept replaying the words in my head, no place for failures. It wasn't just what Connor said. It was the way everyone else let him say it. The quiet agreement in their eyes, the comfort they found in pushing me away. By the time I reached my apartment downtown, my hands were shaking, not from cold, but from the kind of exhaustion that comes when you finally stop pretending. I parked, left the engine running for a minute, and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My cheeks were pale eyes, wide hair still dusted with snow. I looked like someone who'd just woken up from a long, bad dream. Inside, the air was still and heavy. The radiator clanked once, then fell silent. I turned on the lamp, soft yellow spilling over the small studio I'd built piece by piece. The sketches on the wall, the thrift store furniture, the half-finished design drafts. It all looked suddenly fragile, like the life I'd built was something I had to defend. I slipped off my coat and set my keys on the counter. The silence followed me in like an old friend. I made tea just to have something to do, the steam rising in thin curls. I thought about how Christmas used to be the smell of cinnamon rolls, the crackle of wrapping paper, my mother humming along to Bing Crosby. Back then, I believed love meant service, that if I kept showing up, kept fixing things, they'd see me, maybe even be proud. But somewhere along the way, helping turned into enabling. They took what I gave, and when I had nothing left, they called me selfish for wanting to keep the little that remained. The tea cooled on the counter. Outside, snow kept falling quiet and relentless. I sat on the couch staring at the empty space where the gifts had been. The memory of Connor's smirk replayed sharper now. It wasn't just arrogance, it was certainty. He knew I wouldn't fight back. He'd seen me give too much too long. They all had. But something inside me felt different tonight. Not anger exactly, something quieter, steadier. A hum beneath the hurt. I'd been the dependable one for so long that they forgot I could walk away. Maybe I had too. I stood and pulled the curtains open. The city lights shimmered against the snow, reflecting off the glass in 1,000 small flickers. It looked almost peaceful. The kind of peace that comes after breaking. I pressed my hand against the cold window and whispered to my reflection, barely loud enough to hear. Not anymore. The words hung in the air like a promise. The next morning, the snow outside my window had turned to ice, coating everything in a thin, glassy sheen. The world looked frozen mid-breath, as if it too was waiting for something to change. I sat at my kitchen table, the same one I'd bought secondhand when I first moved out of my parents' house, and stared at the bank statements spread across it. The pages were smudged with notes I'd made over the years, reminders, account numbers, due dates, all scrawled in my tidy, anxious handwriting. Every line was a receipt for how much of myself I'd given away. For years, I'd called it helping. I told myself it was what families did, what good daughters did. When a bill went unpaid, I quietly sent the money. When someone's car broke down, I offered mine. When Connor lost his job for the 3rd time, I wired him rent before he even asked. My parents encouraged it, of course. "You've always been the responsible one," my mother would say, smiling like she'd just been relieved of a burden. My father would grunt his agreement, then ask if I'd considered lending Connor enough for a fresh start. Every request came wrapped in guilt and coated in affection, and I fell for it every time. I remember the first time I bailed Connor out. I'd just started my first corporate job at a marketing firm in Columbus, late nights, endless coffee, and the rush of earning my own paycheck. He'd called in tears saying his insurance payment bounced and he might lose his car. I didn't think twice. I sent him the money that night. "You saved me, sis," he said. "You're the best of us." It felt good then, being needed. It made me believe I mattered. I didn't realize I'd just signed the first of many invisible contracts. Over time, it became routine. My mother would call about small favors that somehow cost thousands. My father, the quiet accountant who believed silence was wisdom, would never object. When I got my annual bonus, I didn't spend it on myself. I paid off their credit card debt. When Connor and his wife Erin bought their first house, I offered to cover part of the down payment. "Just until things even out," he'd said. But things never did. They never even tried. What started as kindness became currency. Every transfer, every favor, bought me a few more crumbs of approval. A rare phone call. A brief, "We're proud of you," before the next ask arrived. I started mistaking their need for connection. I told myself they depended on me because I was strong, responsible, selfless. But really, I'd made it easy for them to stay small while I carried the weight of their choices. The year I left my corporate job to start my own design studio was when the cracks began to show. I was burned out, suffocating in fluorescent light and office politics. I wanted something of my own. When I told my parents, my mother smiled politely. "You'll come to your senses, sweetheart." My father didn't look up from his paper. Connor laughed outright. "You're walking away from a six-figure salary for freelance doodles. That's not ambition, Riley. That's a tantrum." He said it at dinner in front of everyone with that same smirk he wore last night. I remember gripping my fork so tight I left an imprint in my palm. I tried to explain how I'd already lined up clients, how I wanted to build something that felt meaningful, but they weren't listening. To them, success was conformity. Freedom was failure. Still, I helped them. When Connor's business venture collapsed, I sent another loan. When Mom's medical bills came in, I covered the deductible. I told myself it was temporary, that they'd repay me someday, not in money, but in gratitude and understanding. That maybe one day they'd see me not as the safety net, but as someone worth respecting. But that never happened. Instead, the more I gave, the less they saw me. They didn't thank me anymore. They expected it. The requests grew bolder. My mother once called me in the middle of a client presentation, asking if I could pay their property tax that week. I apologized to my client, stepped outside, and made the payment. Later, she texted me a heart emoji as if that settled it. I think the shift happened so slowly I didn't even notice. One day, I wasn't the helper anymore, I was the provider. The silent guarantor of everyone else's stability. And when I finally stumbled, when the weight became too heavy, they called me dramatic. That's the thing about families like mine. Generosity isn't about love. It's about control. And the second you stop playing your part, you become the problem. I traced my finger down the latest statement, watching the numbers blur. Connor's mortgage support, $750. Mom and Dad's utilities, $120. The kids' tuition fund, $300. Grocery reimbursements, birthday gifts, temporary loans that never came back. Thousands of dollars, years of effort. And for what? To be told I didn't belong at Christmas. The irony made me laugh out loud, sharp and bitter. I had built the very system that excluded me. I'd handed them every tool they needed to make me dispensable. They didn't just cut me out, I'd taught them how to. I leaned back in my chair and looked around my apartment. The radiator hissed softly, the only sound breaking the stillness. My life was small, yes, but it was mine. Every rent payment, every piece of furniture, every bill paid on time. I'd done it without anyone else. Meanwhile, my family, the ones who called me a failure, were floating on the lifeboat I'd built, and they had the nerve to call me the burden. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through old messages. There it was, years of digital history. "Can you spot us for this month? The kids' school is late on fees. Mom's car needs servicing, always urgent, always phrased like emergencies. But the emergencies never ended. It was just a rhythm, and I was the drum they beat to keep it going. I thought about the word family and what it had cost me. Late nights, skipped vacations, anxiety that clung to me like a second skin. Every time I said yes, I erased a little more of myself. Every time I rescued them, I made sure I'd need to be rescued later. That night I sat for hours at the table surrounded by papers that suddenly looked like evidence, not of generosity but of captivity. I remembered something my grandmother once told me before she passed. People will take until you make it hurt to take. I hadn't understood her then. I thought she meant money. Now I knew she meant self-worth. The clock ticked toward midnight. Outside, the streetlights flickered over the frozen sidewalks, casting thin shadows through my window. I closed my laptop and let the darkness settle around me. I was tired not from giving, but from pretending it was noble. I wanted to stop being their safety net. I wanted to know what my life would look like without carrying everyone else's weight. The thought scared me at first. Then it steadied me. Because beneath the fear was something else: clarity. If I'd built this system with my own hands, I could tear it down, piece by piece, quietly, without their permission. I stood, stretched the stiffness from my shoulders, and looked at the neat stacks of paper on the table. Each one a story of someone else's mistake I'd been paying for. I gathered them together, smoothed the edges, and whispered into the quiet, as if confessing to myself. If I built the system, I said I can end it. The words settled like a promise. For the first time in years, I felt awake. By the next morning, the decision had hardened inside me like ice. It wasn't a burst of courage or rage, just a calm that felt unfamiliar, steady, almost surgical. The world outside was gray, the snow half melted into dirty slush, but the stillness inside my apartment made it easier to think. I poured a cup of coffee and opened my laptop. The screen's blue light illuminated the stacks of papers still sitting on the kitchen table, the ghosts of every payment I'd made for them. I took a breath, opened my online banking, and began. The first tab was Connor's car loan. I'd set it up 2 years ago when he'd lost his job temporarily, a recurring automatic payment that went out every 15th of the month. I clicked the account, my cursor hovering over the button I'd never dared to press. Cancel recurring transfer. My finger trembled slightly before I clicked. The confirmation box popped up. Are you sure you want to stop this payment? Yes. I pressed it before I could hesitate. A soft chime followed confirmation complete. Just like that, 2 years of habit ended. I moved on to the next, the utilities for my parents' house. That one was harder. My mother used to joke that I was so good with computers, so she'd given me access to their account just in case. I typed through their password and found the billing tab. My name glared back at me under automatic payer. I hadn't even realized how much ownership they'd given me over their comfort. Another click. Cancel. Confirm. Then came the kids' tuition payments, the grocery top-ups, the temporary support for my father's medications that never seemed to end. Each one a quiet tether. Each one a tiny piece of me they never had to earn. I canceled them all. Click, cancel, confirm. The sounds came rhythmically like the ticking of a clock. It wasn't anger that kept me going, it was focus. 5 minutes later, the transfers were gone. The screen was blank except for the words, "No scheduled payments found." The air in the apartment seemed to shift. It was lighter somehow, freer. I leaned back, my pulse finally slowing. I expected guilt, the old reflexive shame that always followed when I disappointed them. But it didn't come. What came instead was silence. Clean, quiet, weightless. I got up to make another cup of coffee, stronger this time. The aroma filled the room, and for a fleeting second I thought about all the mornings I'd spent working overtime just to keep their bills paid. All the hours traded for gratitude that never lasted past the next crisis. It wasn't generosity, it was servitude, disguised as virtue. I looked around my little apartment, my own bills pinned neatly on the fridge, and smiled faintly. Every light, every piece of warmth in this space existed because I'd chosen to pay for it. Because it was mine. My phone buzzed against the counter, snapping me out of the quiet. A text from Connor. You could have at least dropped off the gifts. Kids are waiting. No greeting, no apology. I stared at the message thumb hovering over the screen, then set the phone down. I didn't owe him an explanation. A minute later, another message popped up. "What's your problem?" And another. "Mom says you're acting weird." I muted the thread. I walked back to the window, sipping my coffee as snow flurries began to fall again, small and delicate against the glass. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about who needed what. I wasn't scanning my phone for missed calls or calculating how to stretch my next paycheck to cover someone else's emergency. I was thinking about boundaries, how peaceful they sound when you finally draw one. By noon, the day had softened. I opened the closet and pulled out the storage boxes I hadn't touched since last year. Inside were ribbons, wrapping paper, and a small pile of unopened gifts I'd meant to mail when Connor forgot to pick them up. I added the new ones from last night's aborted visit, the toys, the books, the new coat for my mother, and taped the boxes shut. I couldn't bring myself to throw them away, but I couldn't look at them either. They felt like evidence. Each ribbon, each neat tag proof that I'd spent years trying to buy love that was never for sale. The quiet was interrupted again by another vibration. Connor. I almost laughed. He was predictable that way. This time the message was longer. "You could at least think about the kids. They're asking for you." The guilt was sharp, familiar, but I let it fade. They weren't asking for me, they were asking for what I represented. Stability, money, the reliable sister who never said no. I typed one word in reply, "No." Then I hit send. It felt strange at first, like learning to speak a new language with only one syllable. But it was powerful. Within seconds, the typing bubbles appeared. Then his response. "What's wrong with you?" I set the phone down again and let it buzz. Let him wonder. That evening my mother called. Her voice was soft at first, carefully measured the way it always was when she wanted something. "Riley, honey. I just wanted to check on you. Connor said you've been distant." I said nothing. She sighed when the silence stretched. "Listen. I know your brother can be difficult, but he's under a lot of stress. You don't want to make things harder for him, do you?" I closed my eyes. For a moment, I almost caved. Old habits are hard to break. But then I saw that image of the doorway again, Connor's smirk, her silence, my father's avoidance. The way they'd all stood behind him like a jury I never agreed to face. I opened my mouth and said the only truth that mattered. "So am I." She hesitated. "That's not the same thing." "It's close enough," I said, and hung up. The phone buzzed again immediately, but I ignored it. I didn't need to explain myself. I didn't need to justify peace. I poured another coffee and sat on the couch, wrapping the blanket around my shoulders as the snow thickened outside. It was strange how quickly stillness could become comfort once you stopped fearing it. I looked around my apartment, the walls, the sketches on my desk, the faint smell of cinnamon from last night's candle. For years, I'd filled silence with responsibility. Now I was learning how to fill it with presence. The next day, the emails started arriving, automated confirmations from the bank. "Your scheduled payment has been canceled. Your recurring transfer has ended." Line after line, evidence that I was taking back my life. I printed them out not because I needed the paper, but because I wanted to see it to hold proof that I could make a choice and not apologize for it. That afternoon, the phone rang again. The caller ID flashed Dad. I stared at it until it went to voicemail. I didn't listen right away. I just stood there, hand resting on the counter, knowing that every missed call was a small rebellion. When I finally played it, his voice was flat. "Riley, it's your father. I don't know what this stunt is, but you've made a mistake." Then a pause. "You'll see." I deleted the message. As night fell, I turned off all the lights and sat by the window. The snow outside glowed under the street lamps, swirling and silent. Somewhere out there, my family was probably sitting around their perfect fire complaining about me. Maybe they'd call it selfishness. Maybe they'd call it madness. But I knew what it really was. Freedom. I finished the last sip of cold coffee and whispered to the dark glass, "Let them wonder." Then I closed the laptop, the apartment wrapped in quiet, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt whole. The days that followed felt like standing in the eye of a storm, eerily calm, but surrounded by chaos I could feel closing in. I didn't reach out to anyone, didn't explain, didn't justify. I just let the silence stretch. It didn't take long for them to break first. By Monday morning, my phone was vibrating non-stop with calls and texts, each one sharper than the last. Connor's name appeared again and again, alternating between pleading and furious. "Hey, what's going on?" became, "We're short this month, can you fix it?" And then, "You're selfish. You've changed." I read them all. Then cleared the notifications one by one, watching his desperation pile up in digital form. I didn't reply. It wasn't that I didn't care. I just finally cared about something else more. Myself. My parents joined this chorus next. My mother's voicemails came first, her tone wrapped in guilt and syrup. "Riley, sweetheart, this isn't you. Your brother's under pressure at work. He has 2 kids. You've always been the strong one. Don't punish him for it." When guilt didn't work, she shifted tactics. "You've made things very awkward with the rest of the family. Your aunt asked about the mortgage today. What are we supposed to tell people?" My father's message was shorter, more practical. "Connor says you're cutting off his payments. You know he needs stability. Call me back." His voice sounded tired, but not with concern, with inconvenience. I didn't respond to either. I'd spent years being the fixer, the glue, the one who absorbed every problem so no one else had to feel uncomfortable. But I'd finally realized that in my family, comfort only flowed one way. I poured my energy into work instead. My design studio had limped along for the past year, surviving mostly on small commissions and word-of-mouth clients. But now, freed from the endless drain of their demands, I had time and clarity. I picked up new projects, spent late nights sketching branding concepts for a boutique home goods company downtown, and actually felt excited again. For once, I wasn't working to fill a hole someone else had dug. I was building something real, brick by brick, for myself. The small victories were quiet but solid: a signed contract, a new client referral, a glowing review online. Each one felt like a piece of armor forming around me. But word travels fast in small towns like Cedar Falls. A few days later, my aunt called out of nowhere, her voice cautious but curious. "Honey, I just talked to your mother. She said something about Connor's mortgage being late. Is everything all right between you two?" The question was innocent enough, but I heard the undercurrent, the family gossip wheel already spinning. I told her simply, "Everything's fine," then hung up. I knew it wouldn't stop her from calling someone else 5 minutes later. That was the family way. The problem wasn't who did what, it was who could be blamed for it. And I'd just given them a brand new villain. By Wednesday, Connor's messages had turned venomous. "You think you're better than us now? You owe me for everything I've done for you. The kids are crying, hope you're proud of yourself." I read the last one twice, the line about the kids landing like a punch to the chest. He knew exactly where to hit. But instead of guilt, what I felt was recognition. This was the language of control, the same one they'd spoken my whole life. I put the phone face down and went for a walk. The snow had crusted into a brittle layer that crunched beneath my boots. The air was sharp and clean, stinging my lungs, clearing my head. Every breath reminded me that peace doesn't always feel soft. It can cut too. That night, I came home to find 3 missed calls from my mother and one from an unknown number. I pressed play on the voicemail. Connor's voice filled the room, low and bitter. "You think this little stunt makes you powerful? You're ruining things for everyone. The kids, Mom, Dad. You're not the victim here, Riley. You're the cause." He paused, his voice thickening. "You can't just disappear and pretend we don't exist." I deleted it without hesitation. He was wrong. I wasn't pretending they didn't exist. I was just refusing to keep existing for them. Still, the messages kept coming. By Friday morning, my phone was a battlefield of missed calls, texts, and guilt. But amid the noise, something unexpected happened. My inbox pinged with a new client inquiry, someone who'd seen my work on social media and wanted to commission a logo redesign for their small business. I accepted immediately. It felt symbolic, like the universe rewarding movement. For every connection I'd severed that drained me, a new one arrived that nourished me. That afternoon, I printed out years of payment receipts, every transfer I'd ever made for my family. I stacked them neatly in a folder labeled Closed Accounts. It wasn't for revenge or proof, it was for perspective. I wanted to see with my own eyes the architecture of my mistakes. Line after line, the total climbed: car payments, utilities, tuition, groceries, loans. It read like the history of someone who kept confusing sacrifice for love. I closed the folder gently, feeling both older and lighter. Just as I slipped it onto the shelf, my phone buzzed again. Another text. "You ruined Christmas for the kids. Hope you're happy." My throat tightened. I sat down on the edge of the couch, phone still glowing in my hand. The words hit the way they always did, direct, cruel, designed to reopen the wound. But something inside me refused this time. I wasn't going to defend myself to someone who never listened. I deleted the message, then scrolled up and erased the entire thread. A clean slate. When the last message disappeared, a strange sense of quiet filled the room, as if the air itself had exhaled. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. The silence wasn't empty anymore, it was earned. I'd thought my revenge would look dramatic, maybe even satisfying. But it didn't. It looked like this: a calm room, a cleared phone, a single woman reclaiming her peace. As I tidied up the table, my laptop buzzed with a new email notification. The sender was my client from earlier. Contract signed, the subject line read, "Deposit sent." I clicked it open and smiled. Proof that life doesn't collapse when you stop playing savior, it expands. The sky outside had turned the color of slate, snow beginning to fall again in soft, quiet flakes. I walked to the window, the folder of closed accounts still sitting on the table behind me. The city lights blurred through the frost, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like an outsider looking in. I was exactly where I belonged, in the space I'd built with my own hands. The knock came suddenly, 3 sharp, heavy bangs that made me jump. My heartbeat stumbled. I walked to the door slowly, each step measured. Through the peephole I saw him. Connor. His face red from the cold, his jaw tight, eyes furious. He pounded again, louder this time. My pulse quickened, but I didn't move. I just stood there, watching him breathe clouds into the winter air, his impatience visible in every twitch. After a long moment, he stepped back and shouted through the door, "Open up, Riley! We're going to talk about this." His voice was low but full of something I hadn't heard before: fear. I stayed silent, my hand hovering near the lock. The snow kept falling behind him, each flake catching the streetlight as it landed on his coat. He waited, then knocked again, softer this time. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and whispered so quietly, even I could barely hear it. "Not here. Not like this." But he didn't move. He just kept staring at the door, waiting for me to open it. I opened the door just enough to block it with my body, cold air spilling into the apartment like a warning. Connor's face was red and raw, his hair damp with melted snow, his breath visible in sharp bursts. "You've been ignoring my calls," he said, pushing his hand against the doorframe. "We need to talk." His voice was low, the kind of tone he used when he thought authority was the same thing as control. "There's nothing left to talk about," I said quietly. "You need to leave." He took a step closer, his boots scraping against the floor. "You think you can just cut us off like that? The kids are confused. They're asking where their aunt is. Mom's been crying for days. You think that's fair?" The anger I'd swallowed for years pressed against my ribs, but I kept my tone steady. "Fair. You stood in that doorway and called me a failure in front of our parents. You told me I didn't belong. You made it clear what family means to you." He scoffed. "Oh, come on. You're really still hung up on that. You're too sensitive, Riley. It was a joke. It wasn't a joke when they all stood there and let you say it." He shifted his weight, jaw tightening. "You've always been dramatic. You could have handled this privately instead of playing martyr. You know how much your help meant to the family. Why throw it all away? I met his eyes. Because it wasn't help anymore. It was control. Every time I fixed something, you gave me less respect. You used me, Connor. All of you did. His laugh was short, humorless. Used you. Don't make yourself the victim. You wanted to be needed. It made you feel important. I didn't deny it. I just let the silence stretch between us until he looked uncomfortable. Maybe I said finally, but that doesn't make what you did right. He took another step forward, lowering his voice. You think this makes you strong? Cutting us off. You're ruining lives, Riley. The kids' school called about tuition. The mortgage is behind. You've made things impossible. I straightened. No, Connor. You made them impossible the moment you decided your mistakes were someone else's responsibility. He glared, his jaw twitching. You don't understand what it's like to have people depend on you. I almost laughed at the irony. That's the only thing I've ever understood. His hand curled into a fist at his side. For a second I thought he might hit the door. Instead he leaned in closer, his voice dropping into something almost pleading. You can't do this, Riley. You can't just walk away. We're family. I met his stare head on. You stopped acting like family a long time ago. He exhaled sharply, stepping back. You're out of your mind. You can't just undo everything. You've built this whole system. It doesn't work without you. I know, I said softly. That's the point. His face twisted, fury rising again. You can't do this, he repeated, but the words sounded smaller now. Thinner, as if he knew how wrong they were. I already did. The silence that followed was thick enough to hear his breathing. Then he laughed, a brittle, nervous sound. You think this is some kind of moral victory? You're not a hero, Riley. You're selfish. You've turned your back on your own blood. No, I said, still calm. I'm finally turning toward myself. Before he could reply, a car door slammed outside. Both of us turned toward the sound. Footsteps crunched across the snow, quick and determined. When I looked through the doorway, I saw Erin standing by the sidewalk. Her coat was half-zipped, her hair whipped by the wind. She looked pale but steady, holding something in her hand, a folder. Connor, she called, her voice sharp in the cold. Stop! He froze. His shoulders tensed, his head jerking toward her. What are you doing here? She didn't move closer. I met with someone today. What? His voice cracked. A lawyer. The color drained from his face. You, what? Erin's hand tightened around the folder. I know what you've been doing, Connor. The gambling, the lies, the hidden accounts. I know where the money went. He turned toward me, eyes wild. You told her. I shook my head. I didn't have to. Erin took a step forward, her voice trembling but strong. All those payments Riley sent, the ones you said were for the kids, the mortgage, groceries. I saw the bank statements. You spent them at casinos. He stumbled backward, his composure unraveling. You don't know what you're talking about. She opened the folder and pulled out the papers, holding them up like evidence. I have proof. Withdrawals receipts, transfers to your secret account. I gave copies to the lawyer. He lunged forward, his movements sudden and sharp, but I stepped between them before he could get close. Don't, I warned, my voice low. Don't take another step. He stopped. For a moment he just stood there, his breath ragged, his eyes darting between us like a trapped animal. Then his expression hardened into something venomous. You think you're better than me? You think this makes you righteous? I took a slow breath. No. It makes me free. He stared at me, his chest heaving. You'll regret this. You both will. You'll see what happens when I'm gone. Erin's voice was quiet but firm. We already have. The words hit him like a physical blow. He looked between us, realizing for the first time that neither of us feared him anymore. The fight drained out of his posture, his shoulders slumped, his hands shaking slightly before he shoved them deep into his coat pockets. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the car. His boots crunched over the snow, each step slower than the last. Erin exhaled shakily, watching him disappear down the street. The sound of the car engine starting broke the silence, then faded, until only the soft whisper of falling snow remained. I turned to her, my heart still hammering. She looked at me like she wasn't sure whether to collapse or run. "Come inside," I said quietly. She hesitated. "I don't want to intrude." "You're not." Inside the apartment felt warm and still. I poured her tea, the cinnamon scent curling through the air. She sat at the kitchen table staring into the cup like it held years she couldn't account for. Her hands trembled slightly as she whispered, "I should have said something sooner." "That night at Christmas, when they called you a failure, I just froze." "You were surviving," I said. "I get it." Tears welled in her eyes. "He kept saying you owed us, that you were lucky to have a family who needed you." I almost smiled at the bitter irony. That's what people like Connor do. They call it family when they're taking and betrayal when you stop giving. She nodded slowly, her shoulders shaking. "He's gone. I told him not to come home." I looked at her, really looked at her, at the exhaustion, the relief, the fragile courage blooming beneath it. "Do you have somewhere to stay?" She hesitated. "I'll figure it out. You can stay here tonight." She blinked. "You'd do that?" "After everything, I'm not helping him anymore," I said softly. "But I'll help you." Outside, snow kept falling, soft, relentless, clean. And for the first time, it didn't feel like the world was closing in. It felt like it was opening. The night after Connor left felt unnaturally still, as if the world was waiting to see whether the silence would hold. Erin sat on my couch, her coat folded neatly beside her, hands wrapped around the mug I'd given her hours earlier. The tea had gone cold, but she hadn't noticed. Outside, snow drifted past the window in thick, slow waves. Neither of us spoke for a while. There was nothing left to say. I watched the tension leave her body in fragments, like a woman thawing after years of standing too close to the cold. When she finally exhaled, it sounded like relief and grief tangled together. "He'll come back," she whispered eventually, almost to herself. "He always does. Angry at first, then sorry, then scared. And I always believe him until he's angry again." I nodded. "You don't have to anymore." Her eyes filled, though she blinked hard to hide it. "I don't even know who I am without him telling me what I owe." "Then that's who you get to find out." She looked at me like the thought had never occurred to her that freedom could come without permission. For years I'd been in that same place, bound by guilt, mistaking compliance for love. It wasn't until I'd been called a failure that I'd realized how much of my life I'd spent begging to belong to people who were only ever comfortable when I was small. The next morning I woke to the smell of coffee. Erin was already up, standing at the stove in one of my old hoodies, eyes red but clearer. She handed me a mug when I walked in. "I didn't sleep much," she said. "Neither did I." She hesitated. "You think he's really gone?" "No," I said. "People like Connor don't just disappear. They circle until the attention runs out." I wasn't wrong. By afternoon, the texts started again, this time fewer words, but sharper ones. "You've ruined everything. You'll regret this. Tell her to come home." I didn't reply. I deleted them as quickly as they came, like swatting flies. Erin saw the phone light up and looked away, guilt flickering across her face. "You can block him," she said softly. "I know," I answered. "But I want to see what he does when he realizes silence is permanent." By evening, the snow had turned to sleet, drumming steadily against the window. Erin sat beside me on the couch, scrolling through photos on her phone. Old Christmas mornings, vacations, birthday parties. Every smile looked rehearsed. "He told everyone we were happy," she murmured, "that we had it all together because of him. But it was always your money, wasn't it, that made it possible?" "It was," I said, "and I didn't even realize how deep it went until I stopped paying." She turned toward me. "Why did you keep helping us?" After everything, I stared into the window's reflection, the city lights distorted by rain. Because I thought love meant making sure no one else struggled. Because every time I said no, they made me feel like I was abandoning them. It took me too long to learn that helping people who refuse to help themselves isn't love, it's surrender. She was quiet for a long time. Then she whispered, "He made me feel like that too." The silence that followed was heavy but honest. We didn't need to fill it. We'd both been drowned by noise long enough. The next day, a number I didn't recognize flashed across my screen. I almost ignored it, but something in me said to answer. "Riley Rogers," the voice asked. "This is Mark Dawson. I'm Erin's lawyer. She gave me your contact info." My pulse quickened. "Is she okay?" "She's fine," he said. "But there's something you should see. It concerns your brother's use of funds." I agreed to meet him that afternoon at his office downtown. The building was old with narrow hallways that smelled faintly of dust and leather-bound books. Mark was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a tone that suggested he'd seen this pattern 1,000 times before. He slid a folder across the desk toward me. "Erin authorized me to share this," he said. Inside were pages of transactions, bank transfers, withdrawals, casino receipts, hotel charges. My name appeared again and again in the from column, his in the to. My money had built his double life. Vacations he'd claimed were for the kids, weekend work trips, nights at bars, deposits to gambling accounts, every lie laid bare in black ink. I traced one line with my finger. $2,000 withdrawn 3 days after he'd told me his son's school fees were overdue. I swallowed hard. He was never behind, was he? Mark shook his head. No. The tuition was paid in full months before. Erin sat beside me, silent but steady. She looked smaller in the office chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "We're filing for legal separation," she said quietly. "Mark's helping with the financial disclosures. I thought you should know in case he tries to drag you back into it." I closed the folder slowly. "If he does, I'll handle it." Mark nodded. "I'll send copies of everything to your email, for your records." When I stepped outside, the air felt thinner, sharper. The truth was out now, not just spoken, but documented. Proof that I hadn't imagined the manipulation, that I hadn't been crazy or cruel for finally saying no. Erin walked beside me, her shoulders squared for the first time since I'd known her. We stood in the cold for a moment before parting ways. That evening, my phone rang again. Connor. I let it buzz until it went silent. Then it started again. And again. 5 missed calls in a row. On the 6th, I answered. "You ruined my family," he shouted before I could speak. "She's leaving me because of you." I took a slow breath. "No, Connor. She's leaving you because of you." He scoffed. "Don't you dare talk to me like that. You have no idea what you've done." "I know exactly what I've done," I said, my voice calm. "I stopped funding your lies. I stopped letting you use me to keep pretending you were the good guy. You used me. You lied. And when I stopped paying, you called me selfish." He was quiet for a beat, then spat. "You think you're better than me." "No. I just stopped being worse to myself." His breathing grew ragged. "You're going to regret this, Riley. You can't just cut out your own blood. Watch me." There was silence on the line, long and broken. Then the faint sound of him muttering something I couldn't catch, followed by a click. I stood there with the phone still in my hand, the dial tone humming in my ear like a low hum of finality. Outside, the storm had passed. The world looked washed clean, the snow piled in soft ridges along the curb. I walked to the window, the city lights flickering on the slick pavement. For years, I'd chased peace as if it was something that lived in other people's approval. Tonight, it lived here in this small apartment in the quiet after chaos. By the end of the week, Erin and the kids were gone, starting over in another state. She sent me a photo the morning they left, 2 little boys building a snowman, their faces flushed with joy. Beneath it, she'd written, "Thank you for everything." I smiled, setting the phone down on the table. For once, helping didn't feel like losing. It felt like winning quietly. And for the first time in my life, I didn't need anyone else to see it. Erin's departure left a quiet that felt unfamiliar, not lonely, but clean, like the first deep breath after a long dive. Her absence didn't echo, it rested. The couch where she'd slept still held the faint scent of cinnamon tea and lavender detergent, a small reminder that even in endings, something tender could remain. For the first time in months, my apartment felt balanced, like the energy inside it had finally caught up to what I'd been fighting for. But peace doesn't stay still when other people feed on chaos. It started with the call from my mother. Her name lit up my phone just after sunset when the light outside turned amber and thin. I almost let it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me. "Riley," she said the moment I answered, her voice tight and rehearsed. "I've been trying to reach you for days." I know, I said simply. She hesitated, the sound of ice clinking in her glass filling the pause. "You've made things very difficult for your brother." I closed my eyes. He made things difficult for himself. "That's not fair," she snapped, the softness in her tone vanishing. "He's not himself right now. You pushed him too far." Her words landed like a familiar script, one I'd heard my whole life. Every family disaster had a scapegoat, and I'd worn that role for years. "You've always found a way to make his choices my responsibility," I said quietly. "Not this time." "You're twisting everything," she said sharply. "Do you want to destroy what's left of this family?" "There's nothing left to destroy," I replied. "You just don't like that I stopped pretending there was." The silence that followed was brittle. I could picture her sitting at the kitchen counter, her manicured nails tapping against a glass, looking out the same window she'd always used as an escape from conversations she didn't want to finish. "You used to be kind," she said finally. "I still am," I answered. "I'm just not convenient anymore." She didn't respond. There was a soft exhale, a muttered "unbelievable," and then the line went dead. I didn't call her back. The next morning, I received an email from Mark Dawson, Aaron's lawyer. He'd attached a digital copy of the financial evidence along with a short note: "Connor has been served. Please confirm whether you'd like to include your statement for verification." I replied with one word: "Yes." I scanned the attached affidavit carefully before signing every letter of my name, a quiet declaration that I was done carrying guilt that didn't belong to me. When I sent it back, I felt something settle inside me. Not satisfaction exactly, just a grounded certainty that truth didn't need to be shouted to be heard. By the end of the week, Mark called again. "Just a heads up," he said. "Connor's lawyer reached out. He's angry. He might try to contact you directly." "I'm not worried," I said. "He already lost the only leverage he ever had. You did the right thing," he told me, "legally and otherwise." When I hung up, I realized how rarely I'd heard those words directed at me. Doing the right thing had always meant keeping the peace, keeping quiet, keeping everyone else afloat. This version felt better still, firm-rooted. That night, I sat by the window, watching the city lights scatter across the wet pavement. My reflection looked different now. The exhaustion had faded, replaced by something steadier. I thought about the girl I'd been too eager to fix, too afraid to disappoint, desperate to be loved for her usefulness. She'd believed that kindness was currency, that love could be earned through sacrifice. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The next day, my father called. He never called. His name on my screen startled me more than my mother's ever did. When I answered, there was no greeting, just a long sigh. "Your mother's upset," he said. "She usually is," I replied. He ignored that. "I don't know what's gotten into you. You've made a mess out of something that could have been handled quietly." "You mean privately?" I asked. "Like every other time you pretended nothing was wrong." "I'm not getting into this," he said quickly. "Just think about what you're doing to your family." I let out a dry laugh. "What family, Dad? The one that only calls when they need money, or the one that only defends the person who takes it?" His silence was answer enough. I could almost hear him shifting the phone from one ear to the other, waiting for me to back down. When I didn't, he muttered, "You sound just like your grandmother." "That's the best thing you've ever said to me," I replied, then ended the call. Afterward, I sat for a long time in the quiet. It wasn't victory, I felt it was clarity. I had broken something bigger than their expectations. I had broken the pattern. The days that followed were almost peaceful. My studio was busier than ever. I had new clients, steady income, and for the first time, I wasn't funneling my success into someone else's survival. I started each morning with coffee and silence instead of phone calls filled with guilt. I worked until late, filled the apartment with the smell of ink and paper, and let music spill through the rooms. My life felt unrecognizable in the best way, but peace doesn't go unnoticed by those who thrive on disturbance. One night, while I was finalizing a client's design proofs, my phone buzzed again, an unknown number this time. The text was short. "You'll regret this. No name, no punctuation, just a threat stripped bare." I stared at it for a moment, then deleted it. For the first time, fear didn't rise in my throat. I knew who it was. I also knew he couldn't touch me anymore. I poured a glass of wine and went back to work, the rhythm of my pen against paper steady as a heartbeat. It struck me then how different silence could sound depending on who owned it. When he ignored me, it had been punishment. Now when I ignored him, it was power. The next morning, I walked past the courthouse on my way to meet a client. A small crowd of people stood on the steps, their breath clouding in the winter air. I didn't stop, but as I passed, I thought about all the times I'd walked those same streets in fear of confrontation. Now I felt nothing but lightness. I didn't need to win anymore. I just needed to keep walking. Later that night, I got another call from my mother. I let it go to voicemail. When I played it back, her voice was cold. "Your brother's lost everything. His job, his home. You could have helped. You always could have helped." Then softer, almost wistful. "You used to be such a good daughter." I deleted it halfway through. I stood by the window afterward, staring out at the city below. The streets glowed with wet reflections, and somewhere in the distance, church bells rang faintly. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad either. I'd stopped expecting apologies from people who couldn't see their own cruelty. The only closure I needed was the life I was living, now quiet, steady mine. As I turned off the lights, the last thing I saw in the window's reflection was my own face, calm, unflinching, free. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the family's caretaker, the fixer, or the scapegoat. I was just Riley Rogers, and that was enough. February arrived soft and gray, the kind of month that doesn't demand much from anyone. The holiday lights were gone, the streets bare and honest again. The air held that early promise of spring, but none of its warmth. I spent most days in my studio, the hum of the printer and the scratch of my pen becoming the new rhythm of my life. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, every line, every color choice, every client that came through the door. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was proving anything. I was simply existing on my own terms. Erin called sometimes from Michigan, her voice lighter with each conversation. The first time she'd reached out, she sounded tentative, like she was afraid the ground beneath her might give out again. But over the weeks, I heard confidence bloom in her tone. She sent photos of her boys building snowmen pancakes half burned on a new stove, crayon drawings taped to bright kitchen walls. Every picture looked like a small victory. She'd found a tiny house outside Grand Rapids, started working part-time at a community center, and was taking online classes. "It's strange," she said once, laughing softly. "It's not much, but it finally feels like ours." Those words stayed with me long after the call ended. I realized I didn't envy her new beginning. I admired it. We had both survived the same storm, and instead of trying to rebuild the same wreckage, we'd learned to plant something new. As for Connor, the silence surrounding him was almost eerie. For a while, he tried calling from different numbers, leaving messages that bounced between rage and self-pity. I stopped answering completely. Eventually, even those stopped. But word has a way of traveling in towns like ours. Through a mutual acquaintance, I heard he'd lost his job, defaulted on his mortgage, and moved in with a friend who eventually kicked him out. He was still blaming everyone but himself. I didn't celebrate it. I didn't gloat. I didn't even feel vindicated. It was just inevitable, a man who built his life on lies, finally living in their ruins. A week after I heard that my mother called again. Her voice was clipped defensive. "You've made things difficult for your brother," she said. "He's not himself." I almost laughed. "Maybe now he finally is." She sighed dramatically. "You can be cruel sometimes." "No," I said, calm as stone. "I just stopped letting cruelty wear a polite face." She hung up without another word. I stared at my phone for a long time afterward, waiting for the old guilt to return the familiar ache of being misunderstood. But it didn't. For the first time, I felt nothing. The silence after her call wasn't heavy, it was clean. Life became quiet in a way that felt earned. I stopped measuring my days by what others needed from me. I started cooking again small meals that filled the apartment with warmth. I took walks on weekends past the bakery my mother used to take us to as kids. The smell of cinnamon used to sting, but now it was just a smell, sweet, simple, without history attached to it. Sometimes I'd buy a single pastry, not out of nostalgia, but because I wanted it. I was learning to want things for no reason other than joy. One afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail with a Michigan postmark. Inside was a handwritten note from Erin. "We're safe now, you gave us that." Attached was a photo of her boys holding a sign that read "New Beginnings." I folded the note carefully and placed it in my desk drawer, next to the last photo I'd ever taken of my family together. A Christmas from years ago, all of us smiling under a tree that had nothing to do with joy. I didn't keep it out of sentiment. I kept it as evidence of what survival looks like. That night, I sat by the window watching snow fall through the streetlight glow. I thought about forgiveness, how everyone preaches it like a cure, when sometimes it's just another form of surrender. I didn't hate my family anymore, but I didn't forgive them either. I didn't need to. Some wounds don't close with apologies, they close with distance. As I watched the snow, I realized I wasn't waiting for an apology. I wasn't waiting for anything. My life no longer revolved around who understood me or who didn't. I had spent years mistaking sacrifice for love, believing that being needed meant being valued. But love isn't measured in how much you give away. It's measured in how much of yourself you choose to keep. The next weekend, I gathered up the last of my Christmas decorations, boxes of ornaments, lights, ribbons that hadn't seen daylight since the night I'd been turned away. I loaded them into my car and drove to the local donation center. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, smiled as she took the boxes. "Would you like a receipt?" she asked. I shook my head. "No," I said, smiling. I already kept what mattered, the lesson. Driving home, I passed my parents' street. Their house looked smaller now, its white paint dull against the winter sky. The porch light was still on, glowing like a stage lamp after the play had ended. I slowed the car just long enough to look. For a moment, I wondered if they still talked about me. If they still called me selfish or heartless. Maybe they did. Maybe they always would. But their opinion had stopped being currency in my life. They couldn't define me anymore. I turned the corner, leaving the street and the ghosts of who I'd been behind. When I parked outside my apartment, the air was sharp and cold. I stepped out, tilting my head back to watch the snow fall soft and steady, catching the light in quiet flashes. It reminded me of that night months ago when I'd stood outside their door holding the bag of gifts they'd never open. Back then, the snow had felt heavy, suffocating. Tonight, it felt clean. Standing there, I thought about the word loser. The one Connor had thrown at me like a weapon. The one my parents had silently agreed with. Maybe losers weren't what they thought. Maybe losers were just people who finally stopped paying for everyone else's mistakes. I climbed the steps to my building, unlocked the door, and stepped into the warmth of my apartment. Everything was still: the hum of the heater, the faint smell of cinnamon, the familiar clutter of my workspace. I walked to the window one last time, watching the snow drift lazily through the air. "If you've ever had to walk away from people who mistook your kindness for weakness," I whispered, "you know this feeling." Outside, the snow kept falling, the world quiet and whole. And in that stillness, I understood something simple and absolute. I wasn't the loser that night. I was the one who finally stopped paying for their lies. Riley takes one last breath, her voice calm as she closes this chapter of her life, reminding us that peace sometimes comes in the quiet act of walking away. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more powerful tales of family betrayal and redemption. Share your thoughts below. We read every single comment you leave. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.